Hello, I'm Audible editor Rachel Sherry, and with me here today at Audible is Kody Keplinger, an amazing author and just all-around talented human being. You may know her as the author of The Dump, which was made into a major motion picture. She's also the author of several other YA novels, including That's Not What Happened, which came out just this year in August. Welcome to Audible.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad that you're here. So, of course, since we are here at Audible, I'm going to ask you a pretty easy first question. I've heard that audiobooks are near and dear to your heart. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because I am visually impaired, I was born legally blind. I actually used to hate books. I hated reading when I was a kid, and in large part because it was really difficult for me visually. And then when I was, I guess, about 9 or 10, my mom started reading the Harry Potter books out loud to me to try to get me into reading again. And I got so invested that she couldn't keep up with reading them out loud to me. So we had to start buying the audiobooks and that Jim Dale narrates. And they just completely blew my mind. And I fell in love with reading again. And I listen to audiobooks pretty much all the time now. Like, that is my primary source of reading. Occasionally I will read something visually with, like assistive technology or something, but 90% of my reading is audiobooks.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I think so many of our listeners would probably have the same experience of having listened to Harry Potter first. And I know you mentioned Jim Dale. So what do you think does make a really good narrator or a good audio performance?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. The thing is, audio performances I think are really, really crucial. I think I've listened to books before that I fell in love with and then realized later, I'm like, I wonder if I would have liked that book as much if I had read it visually. And I didn't know if I would, actually. Because a really good narrator can completely alter a reading experience. The best audiobooks for me are when I listen to them and it doesn't feel stilted, it doesn't feel like someone is reading, it feels like the character is speaking directly to me.
So, as an author, what is it like hearing your books narrated?
It's really awesome. It's a really cool experience because, sometimes the narrator that gets matched doesn't sound exactly like the character did in my head, but they might end up kind of swaying me in the direction of being like, no, I can picture this. This is good. I get so used to it that it feels like this feels right. And then other times they match the character in my head, the voice of the character in my head so perfectly it's surreal. A good example of this is one of my books, A Midsummer's Nightmare. I had picked the narrator for that one. I had specifically requested Renata Friedman because I'd heard her read other books. And the character in that book, Whitley, has just such a specific voice to me. And this was the only voice that I felt made sense. She just had this she was really good at doing the kind of exasperated, apathetic teenager voice, but still giving it emotion. Listening to it, I was like, yes, this is Whitley. This is exactly how she's supposed to sound. And that was such a neat experience to get to hear this voice that I'd had in my head for so long that was so specific actually be vocalized in a way that made me go, yeah, that is how I heard it in my head. This is exactly right.
Speaking of emotional performances, and certainly all of your novels are emotional and have really complex and great characters, I know your latest novel, That's Not What Happened, it has themes of, a school shooting. It is not an easy subject to broach, but in your own words, could you talk about what it's about and what kind of inspired you to write this novel?
Of course. That's Not What Happened is a book set 3 years after a school shooting, in which a group of survivors, the 6 people who witnessed the shooting, speak up about the events of that day and some of the misconceptions that surround the events of that day, and essentially start trying to reclaim the narrative. We currently live in a society, and we have lived in a society for quite a while, actually, where mass shootings are incredibly common. I think every year we say that they're happening more and more, but in reality, if you actually looked at the numbers, they've been very consistent for a long time, and it's just that almost nothing has changed. A lot of people think, for example, that Columbine was like the first, and it was like, no, Columbine was not even close to the first. It was just the first to grab the mainstream news coverage in the 24-hour news cycle. As I began kind of thinking about mass shootings and researching them and looking into our country's history of them, I began realizing that there's a lot of patterns that are very consistent with how the media covers mass shootings. And especially with how the media covers the mass shooting as opposed to how survivors then talk about it later. And I thought that that was an angle I hadn't really seen written about in fiction much. And it became one that really, really haunted me. It really kind of made me feel like I was complacent in something that I didn't like. I was a part of the problem in that I bought into the news coverage. I believed some of the myths that had been spread. I bought into the sensationalism. And it made me feel bad. It made me feel like I need to explore this part of reality in a way that, I understand, and the way I understand how to explore things is through writing.
Yeah, and I definitely felt all of your emotion and frustration come through your writing, and also in hearing it performed by a multicast, actually.
Yeah, that made me so happy. I was so glad that we were able to get multiple narrators. It felt really, really crucial to me that while Lee, the main character, tells the majority of the story, it felt really crucial to me that we get other narrators in to read the letters that the other characters write and really separate their voices and keep them stand out. And I'm so glad with how it turned out.
And I'm glad that you mentioned Lee. Lee is a really interesting character. In addition to her telling her story about her best friend passing away and surviving a tragedy, there's also this really just emotional part in the novel where she explains how close she was to her friend Sarah, who had passed away, and she describes the experience of coming out to her friend Sarah as asexual, and being on the A spectrum. And I wanted to hear from you, why was it important for you to include this detail in this novel, and just in your words, and for people who might not know what the A spectrum is, if you could explain what that is.
I think we oftentimes think of sexuality as like along kind of like a Kinsey scale sort of thing, where it starts like you can either be, straight or bisexual or gay, like you're somewhere on that just like straight line. But I always try to explain that there's also a vertical line intersecting with that. I think a lot of times when people hear the word asexual, they assume that means that someone has no interest in sex whatsoever or is repulsed by it. And I'm like, actually, it is a spectrum, just like with a sexual attraction. And we don't talk about that a lot. We don't talk about that spectrum a lot, that there's a lot of in between. In the case of Lee, she is romantically attracted to someone. She's romantically attracted to one of the other survivors, who is a good friend of hers. She struggles with the fact that she's, despite this, she is on the asexuality spectrum. She is probably what would be classified as gray asexual, meaning that she's not opposed to a physical relationship at some point in the future, but she's just not. She doesn't perceive it in the same way I think that some other people would. It's something that she doesn't know when she'll be ready for. It's something that she's never had necessarily a strong desire for. It was important to me because I'm a queer woman, I'm a disabled woman, and I always wanted more characters that felt like they related to me, but not necessarily in a story that was about being queer or about being disabled. So in this story, there's a couple of disabled characters, including one who is blind, which I am, and there's a character who is a lesbian, which I am predominantly interested in women, and there's, of course, one who is asexual, and I consider myself to be somewhere on that spectrum as well. Straight, white, able-bodied people aren't the only people who are victims of these sort of tragedies by any stretch of the imagination. And it just made sense that if we have this group of 6 teenagers, they're going to be different from each other. And it just felt right to put some parts of me and my own identity into these various characters in the book.
And I know that representation is something that's really important to you, not just in your own writing, but I know you also helped co-found Disability in Kid Lit. First of all, what is it, for people who don't know what it is, and why is it important to you?
So Disability in Kid Lit is a site that I developed originally along with Corinne Davis, who is also a young adult author. We were hearing a lot of talk about diversity at the time, but frequently we felt that disability was being left out of the diversity conversation. It was often forgotten. We ended up bringing on another really, really wonderful, talented voice, Kayla Whaley, who joined us. Eventually, the two of them kind of took over for the most part as I sort of stepped back and played more of a funding role, I guess. But I'm hoping that it stays a source of information that librarians or teachers who are looking for information on books that feature characters with disabilities, disabled authors, tropes that maybe it might be worth discussing as students read some of these books. I'm hoping that it continues to be a resource in that regard.
Thank you for actually founding it and having a place for writers to go and readers to go where they can think about how they're representing their characters.
I'm glad that even now that it is less active, people still bring it up to me all the time, and that is a great feeling.
What else are you passionate about outside of writing?
Basically being a big nerd. Currently my big passion is I really love to play tabletop RPGs. So think like Dungeons and Dragons, although that's not the actual system I play in, but it's a similar concept. I think I love it because it kind of combines my two favorite things, which are storytelling and theater.
Yeah. Because
essentially you create a character and you have to play them, kind of like with improv, and it's group storytelling, and it's something I'm really passionate about. I both am a player and then I also am a dungeon master in my own game. God, I'm such a dork. But I love it. I'm trying to get back into drawing, which when I say that, people always look at me funny because I'm blind, and I'm like, listen, digital art has opened a lot of doors for those of us who are visually impaired. When I was growing up, I used to draw by hand and on paper all the time. That was actually one of the first ways I started telling stories. I would draw pictures of people, and I would come up with these elaborate soap opera level stories of what they were talking about and who they were. And that was kind of my first entry into writing in its own way. I'm basically a big dork. If I'm not writing books or listening to books, I am probably either playing a tabletop game, drawing, or playing a video game.
That's awesome. And I think we should just clarify that we love dorks. And
oh yeah,
I'm a huge dork. I'm a huge nerd. I listen to audiobooks all day. So thanks for sharing that.
Oh yeah, listen, it's a huge part of my life at this point, just getting to be such a geek. I always describe myself as geeky and gothy, like that's sort of my thing, and if you can combine the two, then I like it even more.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Kody, for coming into Audible today. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you and learning all about your nerdiness and your writing and your latest novel, That's Not What Happened. For those of you who are watching or listening at home, download That's Not What Happened. Download all of Kody's books. She's a fantastic writer, and all of them are available on Audible. You can listen anywhere. I highly recommend that you do that today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.